Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Maine Cooperative Extension's Preserving the Maine Harvest webinar. I'm Kathy Savoy, and today I'll be joined by other colleagues who will be discussing today's topic. They are Kate McCarty, Lisa Fishman, and Lori Bowen. Collectively, we have many years of providing in-person home food preservation workshops, and we're really excited to have the opportunity to provide these workshops in a webinar format. These webinars are designed to provide you with the current USDA recommendations for preserving food at home. Our weekly webinars focus on foods in season that correspond with our Maine growing cycle. We've had some great weather lately, and today we're going to focus on what's in season, which are those great green beans, and include information on how to freeze, pickle, as well as pressure can. Some of those popular varieties that you may have growing in your own garden or will soon see available at the farm stands and farmers market include green bean varieties such as Blue Lake, Provider, Jade, Tender Crop, Tenderette, which has a round pod, or the Roma variety, which actually has a flat pod. Some folks may like to try preserving wax beans, which is a great option as well. The varieties that are best suited for preserving for wax beans include Midas, Gold Crop, Butter Wax, as well as Bonanza Wax. Some housekeeping for today's webinar before we launch into our content is that you can hear and see us, but we actually can't hear or see you. Know that we will have time for questions throughout our presentation, and you can ask your questions by selecting the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and simply typing in your question for us to answer. We also have live closed captioning today. If you would like to turn it on, click CC on the bottom row of your Zoom controls of the Zoom screen and select that option. So let's go ahead and get started with a poll. We'd like to hear from you. What methods have you used when you preserve green beans? Select from the following options: freezing, pickling, pressure canning, or dehydrating. And we've got quite a few people that have cast their vote, and it looks like freezing is actually the most popular amongst our attendees today. Thanks for sharing that poll. So we will be covering that today, as well as the other methods, pickling and pressure canning. So we're going to jump right into the kitchen, and we're going to start by talking about pressure canning, since it is the process that takes the longest time to complete. And then we will also cover freezing and pickling and check back into the kitchen to see how it's coming along. Kate?
Hello. So I'm here in the kitchen. I've got our pressure canner going. I'm going to walk you through the parts of the canner, filling the jars, and then we'll get the jars into the canner, and then we'll cover some other methods and then check back in with this at the end of our time here today to see how much of this process we can get through. So to start, this is the only method for canning green beans plain. So I say plain, meaning not pickled. So we're not adding any acid in the form of vinegar. Kathy's gonna cover pickling green beans. But I'm talking about plain green beans. So I've got a jar of plain pressure canned carrots here. They just have water and carrots in them. And I'm going to show you how to do the same thing with our jars of green beans. So to start, the pressure canner is here on the stove. It's a big pot, stainless steel, and I've got a little bit of water in it in the bottom here. The other feature of this pressure canner is the rack that we're going to be adding directly in right now. So I just wanted to show you this before it got too hot in the water that's in there. This rack is removable, stainless steel, pops right in there. helps to keep your jars up off the hot metal surface, of which it is very hot, and helps the heat to fully penetrate the jars while they're in the canner being canned. So this canner is a 16 quart canner. That's the volume of the canner, not necessarily how many quarts that it holds. It actually holds 7 quarts and 10 pints. So that's a full canner load. To be considered a pressure canner by the USDA, to follow these recommendations I give you today, it needs to hold at least 4 quart jars. So if you already have something that's smaller than that, wouldn't fit 4 quart jars in it, it should not be used for canning. So you might have a pressure cooker that's smaller that fits on the stovetop. But for it to be a canner, it needs to be bigger than holding 4 quarts. And we also don't recommend that you use the electric programmable pressure canners. Unfortunately, they're trending. They are great for cooking meals in, but are not recommended for canning. The research has not been thoroughly tested to show that they generate hot enough temperatures during the process to give you a safe final product, which is paramount. So this is the Presto model, again, the 16 quart one. It's on the smaller size of available pressure canners, so it is the most inexpensive compared to the Miro brand here. Will contain a double load of jars, so you can actually do one layer, another rack, and then another layer, so you could double your capacity. If you really want to get the most bang for your pressure canning session, you can buy a bigger canner. But this little guy is perfect for my needs, for the type of canning I like to do. So let me run through the additional parts of the lid. If you have any trepidation about pressure canning, maybe having witnessed or heard horror stories from an incident in your family about a pressure canner that exploded, pressure canners had a significant rework in the 1970s and have a lot of extra safety features that the ones that your grandmother might have used don't have. So to start, to seal the lid on, inside is a gasket. It's important if you purchase one secondhand, a canner secondhand, or if you just have an old one that is a hand-me-down, to make sure that this is still in good shape, nice and soft, doesn't get dry rotted. So check it every year when you pull it out. Make sure that gasket's nice and soft. That helps the lid seal onto the canner. And then other features of the lid include the vent port. So that's this little post in the middle here. This goes through to the canner, so it's important to check and make sure that it remains clear so that steam can flow through it. So you hold it up to the light, make sure there's nothing blocking it. If there is, you could clean it with a toothpick or a pipe cleaner. Then there's a little lock. So this manually locks the lid onto the canner once the pressure builds inside the canner by pushing up this little post that then engages with a little L-shaped piece of metal on the inside of the canner. So it physically locks the lid on, but it also shows you from the outside that if this little post is sticking up out of the lid, that means that there's pressure inside the canner, and you should not attempt to remove the lid while there is still pressure inside the canner. If you do, it can result in broken jars and burns to you. So this is important to watch for during the cool down process, which we'll go over. And then this little silicone plug, the little black thing here, is a safety plug. So if the canner malfunctions and just builds pressure without releasing any, this little plug will blow off. It'll get pushed out from the underside and depressurize your canner safely rather than exploding like you might have heard in those horror stories. So lots of safety features, very easy to use. So if you have any doubts about your pressure canner or its functionality, you can give us a jingle and we'll be happy to give it a once over to ensure that it's in good working condition. All right, so to start behind the scenes, what I did was I filled my canner with 3 quarts of water. Now this is unique to this particular model, how much water goes in here. So you should be following the instructions that come with your pressure canner. They might vary in small steps or how much water you add. So 3 quarts of water directly into the canner. I brought the heat on the stove up, so I have this simmering here. So that would be my first step. The second step would be to start preparing my green beans for canning. So you can wash your jars. You can wash them by hand, run them through the dishwasher. You just want to make sure they're nice and clean, as well as the lids and the screw bands. So get all your equipment clean and set aside. You want to wash your beans really well, pick through for any damaged ones, rusty ones, anything that you don't want to eat. It's not going to get better by sitting for 12 months in storage. So make sure you have freshest, ripest produce you can buy or grow. And then trim your beans up. So of course, snap the little stem end off and cut them into 1-inch pieces. So this method is what we call a cold pack. So the beans are cold or raw, going directly into cold jars. And I've packed 1 jar here full of just raw snapped green beans. I've got this other jar half packed, and I'll top it off with the remaining pieces. Don't worry, I washed my hands really well before you tuned into me. And we're going for 1 inch of headspace. So that's how much space you leave at the top of the jar. So if there's any extra pieces sticking up, you can get rid of them. Make sure you have 1 inch of clearance using your headspace measuring tool over the tops of your green beans. And then we're ready to add boiling water over the tops of the beans. So I've got my boiling water here, and for ease, I really like to just pour it into a glass measuring cup to then pour it into my jars. Makes it super simple. And here's where you maintain that 1 inch of headspace again. So cover up your beans with water. My water boiled away a little bit, but I've got some backup water. Make sure we have 1 inch of water over the tops. And once you're happy with your headspace, you want to free the bubbles that might be trapped under the pieces of beans. So use the other end of the headspace measurer to run it around the outside of the jar. And then double check the headspace to make sure it's still at 1 inch of liquid. All right. Once you're happy with your headspace, you'd complete the process for however many jars. I'd say if you got a lot of green beans and you're going to run the canner, you might as well fill it up. So you would do those 10 pints. Wipe the rims of the jars where you might have spilled a little water so you can get that nice seal between the jar and the lid. And then apply your screw band until it's fingertip tight. So just using the strength of your fingers to tighten that firmly on there. Your jars are ready to go into the canner. Into the water in there, that simmering, almost boiling water. And you would fill this up with all your pint jars and then lock the lid on. So this one has 2 little V's, one on the handle, one on the lid, that you line up, and then swivel the lid to lock it on there. And I'm going to turn the heat of the stove up to high. So what's going to happen now is the water's going to boil and fill the canner with steam. And we're going to check back in with some of my colleagues to cover other methods of preserving while that happens. And then we'll come back to me and check on the canning process. All right, Lisa, you're up.
Thank you, Kate. So Kate has gone over all of the finer details of getting that pressure canner going, but if you're looking for a little less involved method of preserving those green beans, you might want to turn your attention to freezing. So freezing green beans is a great way to preserve that hull of your garden without going into all of the details of the canner. From a preservation standpoint, freezing does retain more of those valuable nutrients like the water-soluble vitamins than canning does. But we often hear from people who are very frustrated over the texture of those frozen green beans. They complain that they're rubbery when they're cooked. So we've got some tips for you today on how to create high quality frozen green beans that you and your family will enjoy after by watching this short video.
Hi, I'm Kathy Savoy, Extension Educator with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. Today we're going to talk about a simple, inexpensive, and fast method of food preservation, freezing green beans. Equipment for freezing vegetables: clean work surface and knives, clean pot with lid for blanching, mesh basket or blanching basket, cookie sheet, clean towels or salad spinner, digital timer, and an ice bath. Step 1, wash. Rinse and snap tops of beans. You can either leave them whole or freeze in 2-inch pieces. Step 2, blanch. Lower vegetables into vigorously boiling water. Green beans require 3 minutes of water blanching. Once the water returns to a boil, start counting the blanching time. Why blanch? Blanching stops enzyme action, delivers optimum color and texture, kills surface microbes. Step 3, chill and dry. As soon as blanching is complete, quickly cool green beans to stop the cooking process. Plunge green beans into an ice bath for the same amount of time they were blanched, 3 minutes. To improve the quality of your frozen product, remove water by spinning in a salad spinner, placing on paper towels or clean kitchen towels. That excess water creates clumped beans that are hard to break up to use and can cause a loss of quality. Step 4, dry pack and freeze. Pack into freezer-grade materials, removing as much air as possible, and leave headspace for expansion that occurs during freezing. Label, date, and freeze in a freezer set at 0 degrees. Green beans and other frozen vegetables should be used within 8 to 12 months. Recommended materials for freezing foods: heavyweight plastic freezer-grade bags, rigid freezer containers, freezer jars, heavy-duty freezer foil, freezer paper, plastic freezer wrap, or vacuum seal pouches. Materials not recommended for freezing foods: plastic bread wrappers, recycled cottage cheese or yogurt containers, or regular weight foil, plastic wrap, or plastic bags. University of Maine Cooperative Extension is your go-to resource for the latest USDA recommendations for home food preservation. Check out our website for information including workshops, publications, testing services, and more.
So one of the points we really do want to emphasize that was highlighted in the video is that cooling your green beans quickly really is the key to preserving the texture. The ice bath stops the cooking and makes the beans nice and cold before they even go into the freezer, which means that they'll freeze a lot faster. And a quick freeze means the ice inside the beans forms smaller crystals and keeps the cell walls more intact. A long, slow freeze results in much larger ice crystals, rupturing more cell walls and creating a flabby final product. So if you're planning to blanch and freeze a large batch of green beans, make sure you have a lot of ice on hand to keep that water nice and cold, even if that means buying a few 5-pound bags of ice from the store. For best results, freeze no more than 1 pound per 2 to 3 cubic feet of freezer space. Proper packaging will help you avoid freezer burn on your frozen green beans. Freezer burn is damage to frozen foods that occurs when they are exposed to that dry freezer air. This exposure causes dehydration and oxidation, which will affect both the color and texture, as well as the flavor of your frozen foods. The food is still safe to eat, but the quality will be poor. Use moisture and vapor-proof packaging materials meant for the freezer to avoid this unpleasant result. Now we're going to pop back over to Kathy, who's going to talk about a great way to preserve your beans by making dilly beans.
Thanks, Lisa. Dilly beans or pickled green beans are a perennial favorite, and I must say, highly anticipated in my home. They are different than the cucumber pickles in that they always stay nice and snappy. You don't run the risk of having them be overcooked. And again, it's a great crunch. They're great as a snack. They also work well in pasta, tuna, or potato salads. You can also use them in a Bloody Mary or a martini on the weekends. We jokingly refer to them as Maine's olive. So the recipe for making pickled green beans is quite simple. All you have to do is make a brine from white vinegar. Make sure that you've checked that the white vinegar has the 5% acidity. The brine has water as well. And then what we've talked about a lot is the pickling and canning salt. The first thing that you do is add those flavors to your jar that are classic for the dilly bean, and they include garlic, dill seed, and some crushed red pepper or cayenne pepper if you want it to have a little kick. Pack the spices and beans into the jar. I recommend using a wide mouth pint jar for ease in packing the beans into the jar. And you're gonna leave a ½ inch of headspace and cover the beans and all those great flavorings with the brine that has been boiled. Dilly beans can be processed in the boiling water bath canner because you've added vinegar into the brine, which makes this product acidic enough to be processed in the boiling water bath, and the acid prevents the growth of the botulinum spores into toxins. You process your pints for 5 minutes at a full rolling boil. Now, if you've been following along with us, you may remember from our introduction to boiling water bath canning session that a 5-minute processing time means that you do need to sterilize your canning jars before you fill them. You can do this by boiling jars for 10 minutes in the boiling water bath canner. Then you're all set to fill your jars and can your dilly beans. You can review our previously recorded pickling webinar for everything that you need to know about those pickling ingredients and how to can dilly beans. And know that this recipe will be included in our follow-up email, since you never can have too many dilly beans on hand to last until next year's green bean crop arrives. That's the case in my house anyways. So let's check in with Lori to see if we have any questions specific to freezing and pickling of green beans.
We do. We have quite a few questions. And the first one is in regards to the debubbling. How can you know you've done it enough?
So Kate gave a great demonstration of using the other side of the headspace tool, which again is a plastic piece of equipment, which is great for using as a debubbler. And you simply need to run that around the rim, the inside of your jar a couple of times. And like she showed, going up and down, and that will free any trapped air bubbles. We do recommend that you use something that is plastic so that you don't do any damage to the jar.
Okay, thank you. And in regards to the dill in the dilly beans, can you sub dry dill for the fresh dill?
You sure can. And it seems to me like my dill seed heads have never formed by the time my green beans are ready for pickling. So you can in fact substitute dill seed. It has much more flavor than dill weed. And the recipe that we gave you gives you the substitution recommendation for a dried dill seed versus a head of the dill.
Okay. And one last question in regards to freezing. Could you explain a little bit more about what causes freezer burn?
Sure. So freezer burn is what happens when you have oxygen that is exposed to your food. And recognize that freezer burn can occur with any type of food that you put in your freezer. And you will notice that it has a color change that occurs. Oftentimes people can be confused by ice crystals that may form on the inside of a jar or a bag or whatever type of container you're freezing in. And those are ice crystals. They are not a part of what happens in the freezer burn process. When food does develop freezer burn, you will see it on the surface of the food, and it is a discoloration that occurs.
Okay, that's all we have for questions for right now.
All right. So while we're waiting for the canner to build pressure in our demo kitchen with Kate, I'm going to cover some other basics around pressure canning and how it actually preserves your food. So a pressure canner uses steam in a sealed container to destroy any spoilage organisms that might be inside your canning jars. And it's this combination of steam and pressure that allows the heat to build up to 240 to 250, which is much hotter than boiling water. So again, it's that combination of steam under pressure that builds a much higher temperature. And it's these high temperatures that allow us to safely process our low acid foods, like the green beans that we're working with today, as well as other vegetables. Low acid foods run the risk of allowing the C. botulinum spores to develop into toxins that, if not properly heated, can cause a type of food poisoning called botulism. The high temperature inside the pressure canner destroys any C. botulinum spores in your jars and creates a vacuum seal, which together make your canned vegetables safe for long-term storage. This is an important point. A pressure canner is the only way to safely can your vegetables. A boiling water bath simply does not create hot enough temperatures to destroy those C. botulinum spores. So pressure canners have one of two types of pressure regulators. It can either be a weighted gauge, as shown on the left-hand side of this slide, or a dial gauge. This refers to how the pressure is regulated inside the pressure canner. The weighted gauge is a small weight that's placed over the vent pipe, which Kate pointed out when she was doing the overview of a pressure canner, and it allows that pressure to build inside of the pressure canner chamber. The weight will rock or jiggle once the proper pressure is achieved, and it maintains a steady pressure through self-regulation. These weights are always accurate and don't need to be checked annually for accuracy, and they never need to be replaced unless you've lost it. The other type of pressure regulator, again on the right, is a dial gauge. In this case, the canner is sealed off after venting, and once again, the pressure builds. The pressure registers on the dial gauge mounted on the lid of the cover, and you do the control of the pressure by altering up or down the heat of your stove. This takes a little more practice to master, plus the dial gauge needs to be tested each year for accuracy. We at your local county cooperative extension office can test these dial gauges for you to let you know if you need to make any adjustments while processing, or if the dial gauge actually needs to be replaced. This is a free service for Maine residents. If you happen to be in another state, check with your local extension office for information about their dial gauge testing service. So we'd like to jump back into the kitchen and see where Kate is at with her green bean pressure canning demo. Kate?
Great, thanks, Kathy. We are well underway here. I haven't done anything since I left you. I just have had the heat on the stove turned up so you can see the dramatic change in the top of the canner. We've got this strong V of steam coming out through the vent pipe. This is great, exactly what's supposed to happen, and it's a necessary step for ensuring safety of your canned food. So once you have this strong V of steam, you're actually going to start a timer for 10 minutes and let steam flow freely from your canner. This allows the canner environment to fill up with steam and to expel all of the air that's in there. So an environment that's full of pure steam is going to get to much hotter temperatures than if it is a mixture of steam and air. So this is a really important step for safety that you shouldn't skip. And I think you can all see it pretty well against our dark blue walls here, that strong V of steam that we're going for. So I am timing, we still have about 5 minutes left, but for demonstration purposes, we're gonna skip ahead. For demonstration purposes only at home, you're gonna do the whole 10 minutes. Because I'm gonna apply the pressure regulator. So this canner comes with a weighted gauge. So this one is the little post that you saw on the slide. And then we add one ring to create 10 pounds of pressure, which is what is called for canning pints at this altitude. So I'm here in Falmouth, Maine at sea level, and so I do not need to make any adjustments for altitude. If you're canning at an elevation that's above 1,000 feet, so some Western Maine towns are above 1,000 feet, or if you're joining us from somewhere else in the country, you might be at an elevation of greater than 1,000 feet, and you do need to adjust the pressure for that elevation. The water boils at a lower temperature at higher elevations, which means that the pressure inside the canner is not going to be as great, and therefore the temperature is not going to be as high. So you would need to add more pressure to get hotter temperatures at higher elevations. You can find all that information in our follow-up resources, like USDA. So this is the part where I add the pressure regulator. We'll fast forward a few minutes that we've vented for 10 minutes. And this is the part that makes new canners nervous. You're gonna have to put the pressure regulator through this little bit of steam here, and it might make a hissing noise that startles you. So be prepared for that. And you'll just put it right over the vent port. It's quieter. And then what's gonna happen now, of course, is the steam is being trapped inside the canner, and so pressure is building. And it's gonna cause this weight to rock. Hopefully while we're still talking, we'll get to observe that. So this weight rocking is actually the processing of the jars inside the canner. So that's your visual cue that you've reached the right temperature inside the canner, and you can begin the timing of your process. So again, in this case, it's for pints of green beans, 20 minutes at 10 pounds of pressure for a weighted gauge canner. So once this little weight starts to rock, that shows me that it's regulating itself at 10 pounds of pressure. I would start a timer for 20 minutes. I'll let that 20 minutes go by with a steady jiggle the whole time. You can turn the heat on your stove back as long as you continue to maintain that steady jiggle of your regulator. If you were to lose the jiggle at any point, you need to stop your process, bring it back to a steady rock, and then start the timer all over again. So you definitely want to avoid that because you would end up with an overcooked product. So once you've processed your jars for the 20 minutes required for green beans, then you can turn the heat of your stove off. So that's your first action after your 20 minutes of processing time is up, is to just simply cut the heat. So here we have a gas stove. We can just turn it off at the burner. If you have an electric stove, you'll need to move the canner off the burner so the residual heat from the electric burner doesn't continue to cook your food unnecessarily. You want to be very careful because this canner has gotten very hot during this whole process. And of course, if you have a glass top stove, you want to avoid dragging it across the glass because it could cause it to scratch. We will include a fact sheet about canning on a glass top stove since there are some special considerations around that. So we're going to let the canner cool down naturally. And that can take a while, especially on a hot day in the summertime when you're canning. It can take 45 minutes or so. For the pressure to depressurize out of the canner naturally. If you poke around into the dark corners of the internet, you might find advice about how to hurry up and cool your canner to get your jars out so you can get the next batch in faster. But that's not recommended because the cooling process is actually part of the canning process. So you need to allow it to cool naturally to allow the heat to drop from the jars to ensure that it's thoroughly heated those jars all the way through and creates a safe final product. The way you'll know your canner is cooled naturally is this little lock. I don't think you can quite see it, but this little lock is pushed up right now, indicating that there's pressure inside the canner. That lock will drop. If you're cleaning up your kitchen, you might hear it. You go, yes, it's time to take the pressure regulator off. So when you hear the lock drop, then you can remove the little weight, which will let some steam come out of the vent port again. And then you have to wait another 10 minutes to let the jars fully cool. Then you can remove the lid. You'll want to remove it so that it faces away from you because the jars will be extremely hot. A lot of steam will come out of the canner still. And then you can take your jars out and let them cool. So hopefully you can hear that. There's a little bit of chattering coming from the pressure regulator. That indicates that we're getting close to that desired rocking. That indicates we've reached the right temperature inside the canner. That's what it looks like. I hope you find that it's not as intimidating as you might have imagined in your mind. I'm only leaning away from it because it's hot. So at this point, you would begin your processing of 20 minutes for your pints. Turn the heat back a little. It will still allow the pressure regulator to maintain its pressure, but it won't overcook your food. So that's the actual processing. So once your we'll fast forward. Once you've gone back to processing your jars, letting them cool, removing them from the canner, you'll have a canned product. It will still be very hot. And so you'll let it cool from 12 to 24 hours. I put it on a cooling rack here to protect it from the relatively cold counter. So let your jars cool, come back, check for the vacuum seal to make sure it's safe for long-term storage. And then you'll remove the screw band, label and date the jars, green beans, July 2020, and store them in a cool, dark, dry place. All right, I think that's it for me. If you have questions, I'll be sure to answer them. But in the meantime, Kathy's got one more thing for us.
Great. It's looking good in the kitchen, Kate. You'll have green beans canned before you know it. For our final demo, we've got a great recipe for using those frozen green beans. Our UMaine FNEP colleagues have made a video featuring previously frozen green beans in a great green bean salad. It's a perfect side dish for a light summer dinner. So thanks again to our FNEP colleagues, and let's jump to Lori and see what sort of questions we've gotten in the Q&A box.
We have some awesome questions. The first one is, does the water have to cover the jars in the pressure canner?
So no, the water that we added is just 3 quarts, which is, Kathy's better at that math than I am. It's not a lot. It's only a few inches in the bottom of the canner. So it won't cover your jars. And if you're used to boiling water bath canning, it will feel a little strange to just put the jars in there in a little bit of water. And then when you open the canner, when the process is done, there won't be much water left. So it is all turning to steam, and the steam is what's heating your food. So just follow the instructions that come with your canner, but for this one, it's just 3 quarts of water in the bottom.
Okay. And is it okay to use a pressure cooker instead if you don't have a water bath canner?
So I assume that question has to do with, can I use my pressure canner as a boiling water bath for something like the dilly beans that we mentioned? And you can, in fact, use your pressure canner as a boiling water bath. Because remember, a boiling water bath is just a large pot that has enough water in it to go over the tops of the jars by 1 to 2 inches, and also has a rack in the bottom of it to keep the jars off the bottom of the pot. So you can, in fact, use your pressure canner as if it were a boiling water bath. Do not engage your cover, your lid. And also I'll have a tell-all here. One time I was doing this, and I in fact kind of melted my gasket in the pressure canner because I had it tilted on the top of the pot, and it just got exposed to too much heat. So I ended up having to replace my gasket. But again, you just don't engage the lid. You don't lock it in place.
Awesome. So this is my first year pressure canning. What would you recommend as a test product so I can become more familiar with my pressure canner?
Kate, do you want to jump in on that one?
That's a good question. I think something that has a shorter processing time, so maybe even green beans, because they're just canned for 20 minutes. The whole process is going to take you, at least an hour. That's just the bare minimum for pressure canning in general. So definitely start with a cold pack product like I demonstrated here today. Again, if you're used to boiling water bath canning, it's going to seem so simple to get your jars processed or prepared for the canner. And then, yeah, they'll turn out lovely. They are canned green beans. Going in, you have to like canned green beans. So don't expect something that has a texture that's close to frozen. They are fully cooked after an hour or so. So make sure it's something that you like. That's good advice. I think a lot of people focus more on the process and don't kind of lift their head up to see the big picture of like, when I'm done, I'll be left with a canned product, which you might not even buy from the grocery store. Canned beets are a lot of work, but they're also one of my favorite things to have on hand to enjoy since they're fully cooked. And beets are plentiful during the growing season.
That's awesome advice. Thank you. We do have time for another question. And the question is there a difference in the final product between hot packing or raw packing greens, like taste, color, or texture? And which do you prefer?
So one of the things that you'll notice is that if you are to hot pack your product, they have a little bit of cooking ahead of time. So they've actually started to cook and shrink. So you can in fact pack more product, more vegetables in this case, into the jar. Versus a raw pack or a cold pack like Kate demonstrated. They will do, they're going to cook fully in the jar, so they will have more shrinkage that occurs. So you'll end up having more of a water on the bottom as the vegetables have shrunk and are kind of floating near the top. Texturally, to me, they both still taste like canned vegetables, which have been cooked for both have been cooked for a long period of time. So I don't notice much texturally or to look at a difference. They both develop that dark sort of army green color that you're familiar with a canned vegetable.
Okay. I don't want to push it. I was wondering if we could sneak one more question in, but maybe we can come back around if we have a few minutes left.
Okay. So here are the list of the resources that you'll receive in our follow-up email. So everything that we've talked about today, including the dilly bean recipe, which I know several people are looking forward to receiving.
And don't forget about our new Preserving Coach program. So this is an opportunity for Maine residents to be paired with a trained master food preserver volunteer for preserving advice throughout the growing season. And your preserving coach can provide you advice by phone, email, or maybe even in person later in the year if we're allowed to gather. We do have a handful of people enrolled and still plenty of volunteers interested. So if Maine residents are interested in being paired with a preserving coach, you can email me, Kate, at my email address there on your slide.
Great. And we'll be back next Tuesday at 2 to discuss freezing Maine seafood. 'Tis the season to be enjoying our local Maine seafood. And we are going to have a special guest, Rob Dumas, who is the UMaine Food Science Innovation Coordinator, will be joining us. He also is the former White House chef under the Obama administration. So that will end our topics for the month of July, and then we will head on into talking about our August topics. We will be talking about preserving fruit. Think of wild Maine blueberries. We will also be discussing other August favorites, including corn, tomatoes, and salsa. We'll share an email with our upcoming registration information, resources, and recipes from our green bean session, and also that information on how to be paired with a preserving coach. You'll also get a link to the evaluation and a certificate of completion. And if you complete our evaluation and include your US mailing address, we'll send you a free Headspace tool, which is great to use when canning, as you saw today demonstrated by Kate in the kitchen. And Laurie said that we've got one more question, so let's go ahead and hear what it is. And
it's an awesome question. Does the cooling of the canner prevent siphoning from the jars?
It sure does. So you want to make sure and have that cooling process happen naturally and slowly. As Kate said, it can take quite a bit of time. So it's that constant sort of temperature while you're processing your whatever they may be in the pressure canner, as well as a constant steady cooling process that prevents any siphoning, which means loss of liquid from your jars during the pressure canning process. So I'll take it that's our last question, and we all want to say thanks for joining us today. We'll be back next week with the freezing Maine seafood and our special guest. Hope to see you then.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.